Welcome to the Midnight Historian, where history comes alive to inform, inspire, and relax. If you enjoy journeys into the past told in vivid detail, be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, let's step into the history. The American Revolution, a timeline of fire and freedom. Introduction: The Impossible Dream. The year was 1775. 13 scattered colonies clung to the eastern seaboard of North America, hemmed in by forests, rivers, and mountains. Their people were farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, sailors, and preachers, not soldiers. They had no fleet, no treasury, no empire to draw from. Yet against all reason, they dared to challenge the greatest power in the world, the British Empire. The British Army was feared across the globe, its red-coated infantry drilled with precision, armed with bayonets that could turn any wavering line into a slaughter. Its navy, a forest of masts stretching from horizon to horizon, ruled the seas with thunderous broadsides. To defy Britain was madness. To defeat her was unthinkable. And yet, the American Revolution was not only fought, it was won, not by one man, not by one moment, but by countless sacrifices, desperate gambles, and acts of brilliance against impossible odds. Some names would be etched forever into legend: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, but others, though less known today, were no less vital. Henry Knox, the self-taught artillerist who dragged cannons through frozen wilderness. Nathaniel Greene, the Quaker general whose strategy bled the British dry in the South. Daniel Morgan, the rough frontiersman whose tactical genius shattered Britain's best troops. Francis Marion, the swamp fox, who struck from shadows and swamps to terrorize the enemy. And John Paul Jones, the sailor whose defiance at sea shook Britain's pride at home. This is not a tale of inevitability. It is the story of a people who, by all logic, should have lost, and yet, through courage and cunning, endured. Seeds of revolution. The fuse was lit years before the first shot was fired. The French and Indian War had left Britain triumphant, but staggering under debt. To recover, Parliament taxed its colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. To London this was reasonable. To the colonists it was tyranny. Protests turned to riots. British soldiers fired into a jeering crowd on a cold March night in 1770, leaving 5 colonists dead. The Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's engravings spread outrage like wildfire. Then came the Tea Act of 1773. Colonists, defiant, dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. In retaliation, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, closing the port, stripping Massachusetts of self-government, and stationing troops in Boston. To Britain, this was discipline. To America, it was chains. And from the taverns of Virginia to the wharves of New England, voices whispered of resistance. Lexington and Concord, April 1775. The spark came on a quiet April night. General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in Boston, dispatched 700 redcoats to seize colonial arms hidden in Concord. But patriot riders were swift. Paul Revere, William Dawes, Samuel Prescott. Their lantern signal lit the night. The regulars are coming out. At dawn on April 19th, on the green at Lexington, 77 Minutemen faced the British column. A tense silence, a command barked, and then a shot. History would forever call it the shot heard round the world. 8 colonists lay dead. The British pressed on, but at Concord's North Bridge, 400 militia struck back. Their volleys cracked across the water, driving the redcoats into retreat. The long march back to Boston became a nightmare. From behind stone walls, trees, and fences, thousands of militia harried the column. By sunset, nearly 300 British lay dead or wounded. The countryside was ablaze with rebellion. War had begun. Bunker Hill, June 1775. Boston now swarmed with British troops under General William Howe, while thousands of colonial militia ringed the city. On June 17, 1775, the patriots fortified Breed's Hill overlooking the harbor. Howe advanced with 2,200 redcoats against just 1,500 defenders under Colonel William Prescott. The British surged uphill and were blasted back by withering fire. A second assault met the same fate. Only on the third charge, as powder ran dry, did the redcoats seize the ground. But victory came at a price. Over 1,000 British were killed or wounded, nearly half their force. American losses were far fewer, though they had lost the hill. Bunker Hill proved a staggering truth. Untrained colonists fighting for their homes could stand against Britain's finest. The Siege of Boston. For months, the Continental Army encircled Boston. Washington, newly appointed commander, faced a frustrating reality. His men were brave, but his army lacked the heavy artillery to drive the British out. Without cannon, Boston could not be taken. It was then that a young man stepped forward, a bookseller named Henry Knox. Though self-taught, Knox possessed a keen mind for artillery. Washington entrusted him with an impossible mission: haul the captured guns of Fort Ticonderoga, 59 cannon, mortars, and howitzers across 300 miles of frozen rivers and snow-choked mountains in the heart of winter. Henry Knox's noble train of artillery. December 1775. Knox and his team set out from New York with oxen, sledges, and sheer determination. The cannons weighed over 120,000 pounds. Blizzards howled. Ice cracked under sledges. At times, cannon nearly plunged into rivers. Locals shook their heads. The task was madness. But Knox drove on, keeping a detailed journal of every peril. By late January, the noble train of artillery rolled into Cambridge. Washington, astonished, embraced Knox with joy. In March 1776, under cover of night, the guns were mounted on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and the British fleet. When General Howe awoke, he saw his doom. Washington now commanded the city. On March 17th, Howe evacuated Boston with 11,000 redcoats and 1,000 loyalists, sailing for Halifax. Boston was free, not by chance but by Knox's audacity. For the full story of Henry Knox's life and how this young bookseller became Washington's indispensable artillery chief, see the dedicated video on this channel. The British Return, New York, 1776. Boston was a victory, but it was only the beginning. King George III, enraged by the defiance of his colonies, unleashed the might of the empire. In the summer of 1776, the British descended on New York with overwhelming force. Over 32,000 troops, redcoats, Hessian mercenaries, and loyalist auxiliaries backed by the largest fleet ever seen in American waters, more than 400 ships bristling with cannon. Against this juggernaut, Washington could muster barely 20,000 men, many poorly armed and scarcely trained. New York, however, was strategically vital. Whoever held it controlled the Hudson River, the artery that could cut the colonies in two. Washington knew he must stand. The Battle of Long Island, August 1776. On August 27th, General William Howe launched a masterstroke. While his troops engaged the Americans frontally, a massive flanking column swept undetected around the left. The result was disaster. Washington's lines buckled. Patriot troops fled across the marshes and fields. By nightfall, nearly 2,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or captured. The Army's very survival hung by a thread. But here Washington's resolve shone. Under cover of night, and aided by thick fog at dawn, he ferried his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. Not a man left behind. It was a miracle escape, preserving the cause of independence. The long retreat. Through the autumn, Washington's army was chased from one defeat to another. At Harlem Heights, White Plains, and Fort Washington, his men were driven back, losing thousands in prisoners and supplies. By November, the British had seized New York. Washington retreated across New Jersey with barely 3,000 ragged troops, their enlistments expiring, their spirits sinking. Loyalists reasserted control. To many, the revolution seemed finished. But Washington would not surrender. He watched, he waited, and then he struck. The crossing of the Delaware, December 1776, Christmas night. The Delaware River was choked with ice, the air freezing, but Washington had a desperate plan: to cross with 2,400 men and strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The crossing was grueling. Men slipped on icy decks, horses balked, cannon threatened to capsize the boats. Yet by dawn they had crossed. At Trenton, 1,400 Hessians under Colonel Johann Rall were groggy from holiday revels. Washington's men stormed the town. Musket volleys shattered the Hessians' ranks. Rall fell, mortally wounded. In less than an hour, the enemy surrendered. Over 900 prisoners were taken, not a single American life lost in battle. It was a thunderclap. Morale soared. The revolution was alive. Princeton, January 1777. Washington pressed the advantage. Days later, as Cornwallis advanced with superior numbers, Washington slipped behind his lines at night and struck Princeton. There, American troops faltered under British fire until Washington himself rode forward, rallying them. Musket balls whistled past, but he sat tall in the saddle, urging his men on. The Americans surged, driving the British back. In 2 weeks, the tide had turned. From despair, Washington had seized victory. The British were forced to retreat to New Brunswick, abandoning much of New Jersey. Europe took note. The rebellion was no mere rabble. The war at sea. While armies clashed on land, the ocean became another battlefield. The British Navy ruled the seas, but American privateers and continental ships struck back with daring raids. Among them was a fiery Scotsman turned American hero, John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, I have not yet begun to fight. In 1779, Jones commanded the Bonhomme Richard, an old French vessel refitted for war. Off the coast of England, he encountered HMS Serapis, a powerful 44-gun frigate. The battle was savage. Cannon tore hulls to splinters. Men fell screaming from rigging. Decks ran slick with blood. At one point, as his ship burned and his crew faltered, the British captain called for surrender. Jones roared back words that would echo through history. "I have not yet begun to fight." Lashing his ship to the Serapis, Jones's men poured fire at point-blank range. After hours of carnage, the British captain struck his colors. Though the Bonhomme Richard sank, Jones had captured the enemy. He had carried the war to Britain's very shores, humiliating the empire. For Jones's full saga, from his early voyages to his legendary duel on the high seas, see the dedicated deep dive video on this channel. The war enters a new phase. By 1777, the conflict was far from decided. Britain sought to crush the rebellion by severing New England from the rest of the colonies. Armies moved toward the Hudson River Valley, setting the stage for campaigns that would bring both disaster and triumph. The revolution was no longer a local uprising. It was becoming a global war. The British divide their forces. 1777. After the shock of Trenton and Princeton, Britain re-evaluated. The empire still commanded unmatched resources, but crushing the rebellion would require strategy. The plan was bold. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada with 8,000 troops, seize Albany, and cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. Meanwhile, General Howe would push north from New York City. If the two forces met on the Hudson, New England, the heart of the rebellion would be strangled. But coordination faltered. Howe chose instead to seize Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne to march alone into the wilderness of upstate New York. Burgoyne's march. Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, advanced with a force of redcoats, Hessians, native allies, and loyalists. His army dragged an immense baggage train, wagons, officers' luxuries, even cases of wine. At first, the advance seemed unstoppable. British troops captured Fort Ticonderoga, forcing the Americans to retreat. Loyalist hopes soared. But the wilderness closed in. Roads were blocked by felled trees. Supplies dwindled. Patriot militia, rallying by the thousands, struck Burgoyne's foraging parties. Every mile south became a gauntlet. Among the defenders was a frontier commander whose men would prove decisive, Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan and the riflemen. Morgan was no polished officer. Born on the Virginia frontier, he had been a wagoner, a brawler, and even flogged for striking a British officer during the French and Indian War. But he knew the land, the people, and above all, the rifle. Morgan commanded a corps of sharpshooters armed with long rifles, accurate far beyond the smooth-bore muskets of the day. Where a musket could hit a man at 80 yards, Morgan's riflemen could strike at 200 with lethal precision. These men were America's scalpel against Britain's sledgehammer. The battles of Saratoga, September to October 1777. Burgoyne's march ground to a halt near Saratoga, where American forces under General Horatio Gates entrenched. On September 19th, Burgoyne attacked in the Battle of Freeman's Farm. His disciplined redcoats pressed forward, but Morgan's riflemen picked off officers and gunners, sowing chaos. The field was drenched in blood, yet neither side held a clear victory. 3 weeks later, on October 7th, Burgoyne tried again at the Battle of Bemis Heights. This time, American forces counterattacked fiercely. Morgan's men shattered the British right. Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, charged into the fray, rallying troops in a reckless fury. The British line collapsed. Surrounded and starved, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of 5,800 men on October 17, 1777. The turning point. The surrender at Saratoga electrified the world. For the first time, a British field army had capitulated to colonial forces. In Paris, French ministers, long watching the rebellion with interest, were convinced. In February 1778, France formally allied with the United States, bringing money, supplies, fleets, and soldiers. The revolution was no longer just Britain's colonial rebellion. It was now a world war. For the full story of Daniel Morgan, from his wilderness rifleman at Saratoga to his crowning victory at Cowpens, see his dedicated deep dive video on this channel. The Road to Valley Forge. Even as victory shone at Saratoga, Washington's army reeled from defeat in Pennsylvania. In September 1777, Howe captured Philadelphia after victories at Brandywine and Germantown. Congress fled the capital. Washington withdrew to winter quarters at Valley Forge, 20 miles outside the city. The Winter of Suffering, 1777 to 1778. Valley Forge was not a battle, but it was a crucible. Nearly 12,000 men huddled in makeshift huts. Food was scarce, clothing tattered, disease stalked the camp. By spring, 2,000 would be dead. Yet amid the suffering, a miracle of discipline emerged. Into camp came Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian veteran with a gift for drilling troops. Day after day, he forged the ragged soldiers into a true army, teaching them precision maneuvers, bayonet charges, and discipline. When the snows melted, the Continental Army was no longer a mob of militia. It was a professional force, ready to stand toe-to-toe with Britain. A war transformed. By 1778, the war had changed. Britain still held New York and Philadelphia, but the colonies had survived. The French alliance promised fleets and reinforcements. The Continental Army was reborn. But the struggle was far from over. The fight would rage across frontiers, seas, and swamps. New heroes would rise, like the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion striking from the Carolina backcountry, and Nathaniel Greene, whose strategic brilliance would sap Britain's strength in the South. The Revolution was entering its most desperate and decisive years. Britain shifts south, 1778 to 1780. By 1778, the war in the north had reached a stalemate. Britain still held New York, but its hopes of crushing the rebellion outright had dimmed. With France now in the fight, Britain turned to a new strategy: strike at the south. The southern colonies, they believed, were full of loyalists, eager to restore royal authority. If Britain could secure the south, it could march northward, strangling the rebellion colony by colony. At first, the plan seemed unstoppable. The fall of Charleston, May 1780. In the spring of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton led a massive expedition against Charleston, South Carolina. With over 10,000 men and a fleet at his back, he laid siege to the city. Inside, General Benjamin Lincoln commanded 5,000 Americans. For weeks they resisted, but with no relief in sight and supplies dwindling, Lincoln was forced to surrender. It was the single largest American defeat of the war, nearly the entire Southern Army captured. The South seemed lost. Guerrilla resistance, the swamp fox. Yet from the swamps and pine forests, resistance rose. One of the most daring leaders was Francis Marion, a wiry South Carolinian nicknamed the Swamp Fox. With just a few dozen men, Marion struck with lightning raids. He ambushed supply convoys, freed prisoners, and vanished into the swamps before the British could retaliate. His knowledge of the terrain made him untouchable. British officers cursed him, saying it was as hard to catch Marion as it was to catch the fox in the swamp. Marion's unconventional war tied down British forces, kept patriot morale alive, and inspired countless militia bands to resist. For a deeper dive into Marion's shadow war, see his dedicated story on this channel. Daniel Morgan returns. While Marion harassed from the shadows, another hero returned to the forefront. Daniel Morgan, the veteran of Saratoga, was given command of a detachment of 800 men in late 1780. Cornwallis, now leading British forces in the south, sent his cavalry commander, Banastra Tarleton, infamous for brutality, to crush him. The two forces met on January 17, 1781. At a place called Cowpens. The Battle of Cowpens, January 1781. Morgan knew he was outnumbered. Tarleton had nearly 1,100 men, elite cavalry and infantry, against his 800 Continentals and militia. But Morgan was a master of psychology. He placed militia in the front line and told them, "Give me 2 good shots, then fall back." Behind them stood Continentals, steady and disciplined. Behind them, cavalry in reserve. When Tarleton attacked, the militia fired their volleys and retreated as planned. The British, believing the Americans were breaking, charged headlong. They smashed into the Continentals, who stood firm. At that moment, Morgan's cavalry struck from the flank, and the militia wheeled back. The British were caught in a trap, surrounded. It was a slaughter. Over 800 British were killed or captured. Tarleton barely escaped. American losses, fewer than 100. Cowpens was one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war. It shattered British strength in the South and proved Morgan's genius. Nathaniel Greene takes command. At the same time, Washington had sent his most trusted general, Nathaniel Greene, to command the Southern Army. Greene, a Quaker with little formal training, possessed a genius for strategy. He could not win battles outright, but he could bleed the British dry. Greene's philosophy was simple. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. He split his forces, forcing Cornwallis to chase him across the Carolinas. Skirmishes at places like Cowan's Ford, the Catawba, and the Yadkin River turned every river crossing into a battle. Greene drew Cornwallis deeper into hostile territory, stretching his supply lines to breaking. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, March 15, 1781. At last, Cornwallis cornered Greene at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Greene commanded nearly 4,400 men, militia, continentals, and riflemen. Cornwallis had just 1,900 veterans. The battle was ferocious. Morgan's riflemen and militia opened with deadly volleys. Greene's Continentals fought stubbornly in the center. Cornwallis, desperate, even ordered grape shot fired into a melee where his own men were engaged. By day's end, Greene withdrew. Technically, a British victory. But Cornwallis's army was shattered. He had lost nearly a quarter of his men. One British officer wrote, "Another such victory would ruin us." Greene had succeeded. The British held the field, but their strength was broken. The southern gamble backfires. Exhausted and bleeding, Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas and marched into Virginia, hoping for relief. But in doing so, he set in motion the final act of the war, a march that would end at Yorktown. For the full story of Nathaniel Greene, the man Washington called his fighting Quaker, see his dedicated story on this channel. The British turned to Virginia, 1781. After the grueling southern campaigns, Cornwallis's army was battered but unbowed. His victories at places like Guilford Courthouse were Pyrrhic. Each triumph cost him irreplaceable men. Greene's strategy of constant harassment left Cornwallis frustrated and increasingly isolated. So Cornwallis turned northward into Virginia. His goal was ambitious: to strike at Virginia's fertile farmlands and supply depots, disrupt the Continental War effort, and find a secure port where the Royal Navy could support him. Virginia was the largest, richest colony and home to key leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. If Britain could cripple Virginia, it might break the backbone of resistance. At first, the campaign looked promising. British raids burned towns, destroyed crops, and seized supplies. Loyalist sympathizers were emboldened, and thousands of enslaved people fled plantations to join or follow the British army, seeking the freedom promised in exchange for service. Yet the devastation also hardened resistance. Militia bands rose up, shadowing Cornwallis's movements, striking at isolated patrols. But Britain had another weapon in Virginia, one that cut far deeper than raids or bayonets. Benedict Arnold's treason. Few names in American history carry the sting of betrayal like Benedict Arnold. Arnold had once been a shining star of the Revolution, the daring hero of Quebec in 1775, the man whose brilliance helped secure victory at Saratoga in 1777. But wounds to both his body and his pride never healed. Repeatedly passed over for promotion, accused of corruption by rivals in Congress, and embittered by debts and slights, Arnold turned against the cause he had once nearly died for. In 1780, Arnold plotted to surrender West Point, the fortress guarding the Hudson River, to the British. The plan unraveled when the British spy, John Andre, was captured with documents in hand. Arnold escaped down the river to British lines, branded forever as a traitor. Now, in 1781, Arnold commanded British troops in Virginia. With cold efficiency, he led raids up the James River, burning Richmond, Petersburg, and surrounding plantations. Thomas Jefferson, then governor, narrowly escaped capture. Arnold's knowledge of American weaknesses made him a uniquely dangerous foe. Patriots spat his name with venom. For many, Arnold embodied the darkest threat. that betrayal could come from within. The Allies united. Washington faced a stark reality in 1781. After 6 years of war, the Continental Army was exhausted, underpaid, and perpetually short of supplies. The rebellion had survived, but victory still seemed elusive. The French alliance, secured after Saratoga, had already proven invaluable. French gold and supplies sustained the army. French troops bolstered American ranks. In 1780, 5,500 French soldiers under General Rochambeau landed at Newport, Rhode Island. They were veterans of Europe's wars, drilled and disciplined, bringing with them siege artillery, engineers, and professionalism. But Washington knew the key to ending the war lay not just in soldiers on land, but in ships at sea. As long as Britain's navy dominated, the rebels could never deliver a decisive blow. Throughout 1781, Washington and Rochambeau considered striking New York, the heart of British power. But reports filtered in of Cornwallis fortifying a position at Yorktown, Virginia, near the Chesapeake Bay. Yorktown's defenses were strong, but they depended entirely on the British Navy for relief and resupply. If the French fleet could seize the bay, Cornwallis could be trapped. Washington made a bold decision. He would march his entire army south in secrecy to gamble everything on one decisive siege. It was a move fraught with risk, but it would prove brilliant. The Battle of the Chesapeake, September 1781. The fate of the Revolution turned not on land, but on water. In August 1781, Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean with 28 ships of the line, a fleet unmatched in American waters. His orders were clear: secure the Chesapeake Bay at all costs. On September 5th, near the Virginia Capes, de Grasse's fleet encountered a British squadron under Admiral Thomas Graves, sent to relieve Cornwallis. The two lines of battle clashed in one of the most consequential naval engagements of the war. Cannon thundered for hours. Masts splintered, sails caught fire, decks ran red. Though no ships were sunk, the British were battered and forced to withdraw to New York for repairs. The French held the bay. For the first time in the war, Britain's naval supremacy had been broken in American waters. Cornwallis was now isolated. The Siege of Yorktown, October 1781. By late September, Washington and Rochambeau had marched their combined armies, 9,000 Americans and 7,000 French, nearly 400 miles in a remarkable show of speed and deception. Cornwallis, with about 8,000 British and Hessian troops, found himself encircled at Yorktown, his back to the river, his only lifeline the sea, now blocked by the French fleet. The Allies began the siege. Engineers dug trenches inch by inch closer to the British lines. By October 9th, American and French artillery opened fire. Under the direction of Henry Knox, Washington's trusted artillery chief, cannon roared day and night. Buildings collapsed, redoubts crumbled, and British morale sank under the ceaseless bombardment. But two key strongpoints, redoubts 9 and 10, anchored Cornwallis's defenses. Unless they fell, the Allies could not close the vice. The storming of the redoubts, October 14th. On the night of October 14th, the Allies struck. At Redoubt 10, Washington entrusted the assault to young Colonel Alexander Hamilton. His men rushed forward in silence, bayonets fixed, scaling walls under withering musket fire. In brutal hand-to-hand combat, they seized the fort in minutes, capturing its defenders. At Redoubt 9, French grenadiers stormed with equal ferocity, fighting through smoke and fire to drive out the British. With both redoubts fallen, Allied artillery moved within striking distance of the British inner defenses. The British surrender. Cornwallis's position was hopeless. His men were exhausted, his fortifications shattered, and no relief fleet could break the French blockade. On October 17th, white flags appeared over the British works. 2 days later, Cornwallis formally surrendered. Nearly 7,000 troops laid down their arms before the combined ranks of Washington's Continentals and Rochambeau's French veterans. Legend says the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," fitting, for the empire had been humbled by its rebellious colonies. The war winds down. Though fighting dragged on in scattered skirmishes, Yorktown broke the back of British will. In London, Parliament reeled. The war had become too costly, too unwinnable. Negotiations began. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. What had begun as a desperate gamble in 1775, farmers facing the world's greatest army, had ended in victory. Against impossible odds, the colonies had secured liberty. The price of victory. The guns fell silent at Yorktown, but the revolution had come at a staggering cost. Tens of thousands were dead or maimed. Families were torn apart. Entire towns lay in ruins. Farms had been burned and fortunes had been lost. Inflation had gutted the continental currency, leaving many veterans unpaid for their years of service. Loyalists who had sided with Britain fled by the tens of thousands, some to Canada, others back to England, their homes confiscated. Enslaved people who had joined the British in hope of freedom faced uncertain fates. Some were carried away with retreating British troops. Others were re-enslaved. And yet, for all the devastation, a new nation had been born. For the first time in modern history, colonies had broken free of their empire to establish a republic. The odds had been nearly impossible. Yet through determination, strategy, sacrifice, and the brilliance of key leaders, the United States had emerged. George Washington, the reluctant commander. At the center of it all was George Washington, the commander-in-chief. When he accepted the role in 1775, Washington knew he might lead his men not to glory, but to annihilation. He had no standing army, no secure supply chain, no navy. His troops were undisciplined farmers and tradesmen, often barefoot, often starving. And yet, Washington held the fragile force together through sheer resolve. He suffered humiliating defeats. New York in 1776 nearly destroyed his army. He endured endless winters of hunger and desertion at Valley Forge. He was undermined by rivals, doubted by Congress, and faced mutiny more than once. Yet he never broke. Washington's genius was not flashy brilliance on the battlefield, but a steady hand, a refusal to collapse under pressure. And in victory he made his greatest choice. He surrendered power. When the war ended, Washington resigned his commission, returning to his farm at Mount Vernon. In an age of dictators and kings, his decision stunned the world. Here was a man who could have crowned himself, and instead he chose liberty over ambition. Henry Knox, the artillery genius. Few figures shaped the outcome of the war as decisively as Henry Knox. From the very beginning, Knox displayed a rare combination of daring and intellect. A Boston bookseller with a passion for military science, he taught himself the art of gunnery. When Washington needed cannon to drive the British from Boston, Knox volunteered for an expedition many thought impossible, hauling 60 tons of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga across frozen rivers and snow-covered mountains. He succeeded, a logistical miracle that forced the British evacuation of Boston in March 1776. Knox's cannons roared at Trenton, Princeton, and Monmouth. At Yorktown, it was his siege artillery that broke Cornwallis's defenses, reducing redoubts to rubble. His skill turned scattered militias into a force that could stand against the greatest army on earth. And his legacy endured far beyond the Revolution. As the nation's first Secretary of War, Knox laid the foundations of the U.S. Army. His name became synonymous with security and strength, hence the saying, "As secure as Fort Knox." Nathaniel Greene, the master of strategy. If Washington was the heart of the Revolution, Nathaniel Greene was its mind. A Quaker with no formal military training, Greene rose from militia officer to Washington's most trusted general. After catastrophic defeats in the South, Greene was handed the near-hopeless task of reclaiming the Carolinas. With fewer than 2,000 men facing Cornwallis's 8,000, Greene adopted a brilliant strategy: avoid destruction, bleed the enemy, and strike only when opportunity favored him. At Cowpens, his subordinate Daniel Morgan annihilated a British force with Greene's blessing. At Guilford Courthouse, Greene fought Cornwallis head-on, inflicting such heavy losses that Britain's victory was hollow. Again and again, Greene forced Cornwallis to march deeper into hostile territory, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. Cornwallis himself admitted, "Greene is as dangerous as Washington. He fights, retreats, fights again, until he wears us down." By the time Cornwallis limped into Virginia, it was Greene's relentless campaign that had set the stage for Yorktown. Daniel Morgan, the rifleman's fury. If Greene was the strategist, Daniel Morgan was the hammer. A towering frontiersman who once worked as a wagoner, Morgan was tough, foul-mouthed, and adored by his men. He commanded riflemen whose deadly accuracy terrified British officers. At Saratoga in 1777, his sharpshooters picked off enemy leaders and shattered Burgoyne's advance. But Morgan's masterpiece came at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781. Facing the feared Banastra Tarleton, Morgan arranged his troops in layers, skirmishers in front, militia behind, and Continentals at the rear. He instructed the militia to fire 2 volleys and retreat, a planned withdrawal that fooled the British into thinking the Americans were routing. Tarleton charged straight into the trap. Morgan's Continentals wheeled around, the cavalry slammed into the flanks, and the British force was annihilated. It was one of the most complete American victories of the war. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. In the Carolina lowlands, another legend rose: Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Marion understood that victory wasn't only about great battles, it was about survival. With just a few dozen men, he launched guerrilla raids from the swamps, striking British outposts, ambushing patrols, and vanishing into the wilderness before retaliation could come. His men rode lean horses, knew every backwater trail, and survived on little more than cornmeal and wild game. British troops cursed him. Tarleton himself reportedly said, "The devil himself could not catch this swamp fox." Marion's raids tied down thousands of British soldiers, forced them to spread thin, and inspired Southern patriots to resist. He embodied a different kind of warfare, not of armies and sieges, but of shadows and survival. John Paul Jones, the Sea Wolf. On land, Knox, Greene, Morgan, and Marion shaped the war. At sea, one name thundered above all others: John Paul Jones. A Scottish-born sailor who made America his adopted cause, Jones became the terror of Britain's coasts. In 1779, commanding the worn but defiant Bonhomme Richard, he engaged the powerful HMS Serapis off Flamborough Head. The battle raged into the night, cannon blasting at near point-blank range, rigging torn to shreds, decks slick with blood. When asked if he would surrender, Jones shouted his immortal words, "I have not yet begun to fight." Hours later, after savage boarding actions, the Serapis struck her colors. Though the Bonhomme Richard sank beneath him, Jones had captured the superior ship. A victory that electrified Europe and proved that the young United States could challenge the Royal Navy. The legacy of Yorktown. Yorktown did not end all fighting immediately. Skirmishes flared in the south and west, and naval clashes continued abroad. But the world understood. The tide had turned irreversibly. Britain's Parliament voted to cease offensive operations. Negotiators gathered in Paris. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The 13 colonies were now free and independent states, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The revolution had begun with farmers and shopkeepers firing muskets on Lexington Green. It ended with a coalition army, American and French, defeating one of the greatest empires on earth. Immortal heroes. Each of the figures we've traced played a vital role in the outcome. Washington held the cause together. Knox gave the patriots the firepower to match the empire. Greene outmaneuvered Britain in the south. Morgan struck with devastating precision. Marion bled the enemy with guerrilla fury. Jones carried the fight to Britain's own shores. They fought not for conquest, but for an idea: liberty. Their achievements were improbable, their odds impossible, and yet they prevailed. Epilogue: a world turned upside down. When the British band supposedly played "The World Turned Upside Down" at Yorktown, it captured the spirit of the moment. The revolution had defied the logic of history. A ragged band of colonies, without wealth, without a navy, without professional armies, had defeated the world's superpower. And they had done it not through chance alone, but through courage, ingenuity, and the leadership of extraordinary men whose names still echo through history. Their legacy is carved not just in monuments or fortresses, but in the very survival of the United States. Each cannon hauled by Knox, each swamp raid by Marion, each maneuver by Greene, each volley fired by Morgan, each broadside commanded by Jones, each order given by Washington, they were the building blocks of a nation. The revolution was not the end of struggle. It was the beginning of a grand, imperfect, ongoing experiment, a republic built on the belief that people could govern themselves. And for that experiment to even begin, it took men who dared the impossible, who stood when retreat was wiser, who fought when surrender was expected. These were America's first heroes. Grand epilogue, the spark of a nation. The silence after the guns. The echoes of musket fire and the thunder of cannon faded after Yorktown. Fields that had once shaken under marching armies fell quiet, leaving behind the wreckage of war, broken wagons, shallow graves, shattered homesteads, burned-out towns. But in that silence, something profound stirred. For the first time in 8 years, the American people could imagine a future not defined by survival alone. The revolution had not merely ended a war, it had uprooted the very foundations of the old world. The idea that subjects could overthrow a king and stand as sovereign citizens had leapt from theory to reality. Yet the road ahead was as treacherous as the campaigns that had preceded it. The wounds of war. The cost of victory was immense. Nearly 25,000 Americans had perished, whether on the battlefield, in prison hulks rotting in New York Harbor, or from disease that swept through crowded camps. Tens of thousands more were scarred in body or in spirit. Towns like Charleston, Savannah, and Newport bore the scars of bombardment. The once bustling port of New York had endured years of brutal British occupation. The southern backcountry was left smoldering, its plantations raided, its fields salted with grief. The economy teetered on collapse. Inflation had gutted the continental currency. A paper dollar was derided as not worth a continental. Farmers who had fed armies returned to find their land stripped, their families impoverished. Veterans who had given the flower of their youth now begged Congress for back pay that often never came. And yet, amid the devastation, there was pride. A battered people had not only withstood the storm of empire, they had prevailed. The people awaken. The true revolution was not in muskets or treaties, but in the spirit of ordinary Americans. Farmers who had once bowed before royal governors now debated laws in their town halls. Tradesmen who had risked everything to sign enlistment rolls returned with the pride of citizen soldiers. Women who had managed farms and businesses, nursed the wounded, and spied for the cause began to voice a quiet question. If liberty was a right, should it not extend to them as well? For enslaved Africans who had fought on both sides, the revolution was both hope and tragedy. Many who had joined British regiments were evacuated to Nova Scotia or the Caribbean with promises of freedom kept, if only barely. Others were cruelly returned to bondage in the newborn republic. And yet, even among those still enslaved, the spark of liberty could not be extinguished. Petitions for freedom, inspired by revolutionary ideals, began to appear in northern legislatures. Native nations, too, had been torn by the conflict. Some tribes fought alongside the British, fearing the endless expansion of settlers. Others allied with the Americans, hoping for recognition. In either case, they emerged from the war facing relentless pressure on their homelands. The revolution had freed one people, but it marked the beginning of another's centuries-long struggle for survival. The fragile experiment. In 1783, with the Treaty of Paris signed, the United States was at once triumphant and precarious. The war had been won, but peace revealed new dangers. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at government, left the nation fragile. Each state jealously guarded its independence, levying its own taxes, issuing its own currencies, and often ignoring Congress. The central government could neither raise revenue nor enforce laws. The very unity that had won the war threatened to splinter in victory. And yet, despite the dysfunction, something extraordinary persisted. For the first time, 13 states, once colonies of a distant crown, now debated as equals. They quarreled, yes, but they quarreled in assemblies, not under the lash of a monarch. The revolution had unleashed a new kind of politics, one messy, fractious, and deeply human, but rooted in the belief that the people themselves, not kings or lords, were sovereign. Washington and the model of power surrendered. Perhaps no moment captured the spirit of the new republic more than George Washington's resignation. In December 1783, in Annapolis, Maryland, Washington stood before Congress. After nearly a decade commanding the Continental Army, he might have marched into power, as victorious generals had so often done in history. He might have seized the nation, crowned himself, become the king in all but name. Instead, Washington handed back his commission. "I retire from the great theater of action," he declared, his voice heavy with relief. With those words, he returned to Mount Vernon, eager for the quiet life of a farmer. The world was stunned. Across Europe, monarchs could scarcely believe it. One observer wrote, "This was the greatest act of any man in history. By surrendering power, Washington embodied the principle that the revolution was not for personal glory, but for liberty itself." The Constitution, a nation forged anew. The fragility of the Confederation soon became clear. In 1786, Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of debt-ridden farmers in Massachusetts, threatened to topple state governments. Panic spread. If America could not govern itself, would the revolution unravel? In 1787, leaders gathered in Philadelphia. Washington, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton, and others debated in sweltering secrecy. What emerged was nothing less than a reinvention of government, the Constitution of the United States. It was not perfect. It left contradictions unresolved, slavery unchallenged, rights unevenly distributed. But it created a framework that balanced power between states and a federal union. A presidency strong yet checked, a Congress representative yet limited, and, after fierce demand, a Bill of Rights to protect liberties hard won. The revolution had created a nation. The Constitution gave it endurance. The world watches. Abroad, the shock waves spread. Kings trembled. If subjects in America could overthrow their monarch, might not subjects in France, Spain, or Prussia do the same? Indeed, within a decade, the French Revolution would erupt, inspired in part by the American example. In Haiti, enslaved people rose in rebellion, chanting the language of liberty they had seen from across the sea. Across Europe, reformers invoked the American cause as proof that the world could be remade. America had not only freed itself, it had lit a torch that others would carry. The heroes remembered. And what of the heroes who had shaped the war? Henry Knox, who had dragged cannons through snow and directed the thunder at Yorktown, became Secretary of War, ensuring the young republic had a force to defend it. Nathaniel Greene, the strategist of the South, returned to ruined plantations but was hailed as second only to Washington in genius. Daniel Morgan, the rifleman, retired to his Virginia farm, his legend etched forever in the victory at Cowpens. Francis Marion, the swamp fox, carried his guerrilla fame into politics, serving in the South Carolina Assembly. John Paul Jones, though dying young in Paris, remained immortal for his cry, "I have not yet begun to fight." George Washington, the indispensable man, would be called from retirement once more to serve as the nation's first president. Their names became more than men. They became symbols of resilience, ingenuity, and defiance. The spark that endures. The revolution did not solve every injustice. It did not create a perfect society, but it did something perhaps greater. It created a spark. That spark burned in the hearts of a people who believed they could govern themselves. It lit the path for generations who would demand freedom's promises be kept, for women, for the enslaved, for immigrants, for all who followed. It told the world that even against impossible odds, liberty could prevail. Closing reflections. The American Revolution began with smoke rising from Lexington Green and ended with the world turned upside down at Yorktown. It spanned frozen rivers, swampy backwaters, storm-tossed seas, and blood-soaked fields. It was fought by men and women, soldiers and civilians, leaders and nameless farmers, all bound by a belief in something greater than themselves. From it was born not just a nation, but an idea that has endured, stumbled, risen again, and carried forward, that government rests not in kings, but in the people, that liberty is not a gift, but a right. The United States emerged scarred, imperfect, untested, but alive. Its survival was the revolution's true victory. And in that survival lay a message to the world. No empire is eternal, no power unchallengeable, no people too weak to rise. The war forged not only a country, but a hope, and that hope endures, as fierce and unyielding as the shots fired at Concord, as steady as Washington's resolve, as unbreakable as the cry of liberty itself. This was the American Revolution, the birth of a nation, the spark of an idea that would change the world forever. Thank you so much for joining us and sticking around until the end of the video. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the American Revolutionary War and gained a better understanding of the hero's impact on the American Revolution. If you found this video informative, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've got many more historical stories like this on the way. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.